Thank you for joining me for part 6 of the Advent Unplugged series. In this series, we're looking at the characters and the stories leading up to the birth of Jesus from the perspective of who these people were as real live human beings. They had some of the same faults, fears, thoughts, and attitudes that we may have today. So by looking at how they acted and putting ourselves in their place, we can learn a lot about how God would want us to live. I would ask you to please like and subscribe this channel. That way other people will find out and you'll be notified when we have new videos coming online. Today we're talking about King Herod. Not a real popular person in his time, but one that we really do need to look at because God used him in an unusual way. At the end of our session today, we're going to be talking about some discussion questions, and they are these. How do we guard ourselves against crowd mentality? How can we change our own negative influence on others? And how do we stay faithful when we see evil gaining influence? So be thinking about those questions as we go. Herod was one of several rulers that went by the name of Herod, all in the same family. So you have to be careful about which one you're talking about based on what story you're looking at in the Gospels. His name in Hebrew meant wanderer, fugitive, trembler, and coward. One of the features of the Hebrew language is they would often have seemingly different definitions for the same word. And if you look closely, you'll see how those words are connected. Because wanderer and coward, how those go together? Well, fugitive and trembler, closer. But one who is a coward shakes from fear, escapes punishment, and wanders around. So you look at that from that perspective, and that's how that word came about. He was probably about 70 years old when Jesus was born. And we know he was raised Jewish, but in large part, his family claimed Jewish heritage more for political purposes than for spirituality and faith. Speaking of politics, he was very politically astute and well connected with Roman leaders and knew how to get things done. In fact, you're probably familiar with the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, their love story. Well, it was Mark Antony that appointed Herod to the office that he held. And Cleopatra was also involved in large part because Herod's mother had her intervene to force some political appointments that were not necessarily popular, but that's what Herod's mom wanted to happen, and it did. One in particular, there was a high priest that Herod's mother had installed named Aristobulus. Well, he didn't meet a good end because Herod had him killed. So it didn't really work out well. And when it came time for a change in leadership in Rome, Herod backed the losing party. He backed Antony to become Caesar, but Octavian ended up winning the job. But Herod was able some way to schmooze his way back into Octavian's good graces and not have any fallout for not supporting Octavian when he wanted to be Caesar. He was known for some things positively as well. He created some of the greatest construction projects of his time. He was involved in rebuilding and fortifying the temple during his time, a long, extensive process, and he did a lot of work on that. In fact, the Western Wall in Israel still stands today, and Herod was part of that whole structure process. He also built the port of Caesarea using high-tech methods for his day. They actually did some underwater construction projects, and if you imagine the complications of doing that, but he was able to get that done. And also some of the cement mixtures that we use today, Herod used then, so he was very ahead of his time on that. But to pay for his projects, he had to force high taxes on his people. And not only did he pay for projects, he paid bribes to make sure that things worked right, that he got what he wanted. So a lot of his money went to corruption. And because of that, the people just didn't like him very much. He was generally hated by anyone Jewish except for the Jews living in foreign lands who he appointed to office or gave bribes to in order to influence their governments where they lived. The Pharisees and Sadducees hated him for not giving proper respect to the temple property, because Herod installed a golden eagle above the entrance to the temple that, according to Scripture, should not have been there. And he was trying to appease the Romans and also made the Pharisees and Sadducees mad, so you can't have everything, and he didn't. One of the things about him, though, he was ruthless to the point of insanity, and probably was insane. Give you some examples. He had 3 of his sons and his favorite wife, who was one of 9, Mariamne, killed along with numerous other family members when he had this paranoid fantasy about them trying to take over. They may well have been, but because he didn't trust them, he had some of his own sons and wife and other people killed. It got to the point where Caesar Augustus even said it's better to be Herod's pig than his son. Jewish nation, they wouldn't kill pigs for anything, but Herod killed a lot of his sons, so it kind of fit. And one of the really weird things he did is he had an order that when he died, there was a list of Jewish dignitaries that he wanted to be killed so that after his death, there would be genuine grief in the nation. That order was not carried out, fortunately. Let's look at Herod and how he impacted the story of Jesus' birth. Matthew chapter 2, verse 2 says, Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. These were the wise men who showed up in Jerusalem and approached Herod before they did anything else. Smart on their part, because they knew you had to be politically connected and not make anybody mad, so they showed up to Herod initially. And when they said, Where is he who is born King of the Jews? They were likely thinking, well, Herod knew all about this because they knew about it and they were from far away. But this triggered Herod's paranoia. He was paranoid to begin with, but any threat to his rule would have met with a big backlash. Now, why did Herod take this message seriously? Well, for one, he's paranoid. He was crazy. But he also knew that foreigners, especially wealthy ones, were sources of income and influence. Because when the wise men showed up, what did they bring with them? Gold, frankincense, myrrh, and lots of it. And Herod wanted it. So if there was no king of the Jews, he could say, hey, why don't you just leave the stuff with me and I'll give it to him when we find him. Herod wanted to be worshipped, but failed miserably in that because he tried to kill the one that we do worship. In verse 3, it says, when Herod heard it, he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. The word troubled has an interesting real definition. It means to shake what should remain still. That when something is still and calm, you agitate it. Well, Herod's name means trembler. So this word fits Herod's name. It says all Jerusalem with him. They were terrified of Herod's response and followed suit in Herod's upsetness to go along with him and support him because they were just afraid of him. And then in Matthew 2, 4, and 5, it says, gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he asked them where the Christ would be born. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea. Now, he gathered these leaders together, and I can't imagine what they were fearing when Herod calls somebody to the throne room. Are they going to survive the experience? So they probably came with fear and trembling, knowing Herod was upset. But actually, Herod made a fool of himself by asking this question, because pretty much every Jewish child knew the answer to the question, where would the Messiah be born? Bethlehem. Herod didn't know that. And he didn't know enough to know he should know that, and was embarrassed he wasn't even embarrassed about it because he didn't know. And in verses 7 and 8, it says that when Herod secretly called the wise men and learned from them exactly what time the star appeared, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child. When you found him, bring me word so that I may also come and worship him. Herod had no intention whatsoever of worshiping Jesus. The only purpose of him doing this was to find out when and where Jesus was born and have him killed. Now, why secretly? Why not make a big show of all this? Because the wise men were already there. Herod was publicly upset. Well, he didn't want the Jewish leaders to run and protect the child before he could show up to kill him. So he didn't want the Jewish leadership to know what was happening. And one of the things paranoid leaders do is they keep people apart and don't allow them to share information. And that's kind of one aspect of what he did there. The wise men, we know from the story, went on to worship Jesus, but were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. Also, too, we have Joseph warned to take Mary and Jesus to Egypt. So the wise men didn't show up. Mary and Joseph were gone. and Herod had no real way of tracking them because he didn't have any positive influence in Egypt. The only way he could get anything done in Egypt was massive bribes. In verse 16 it says, Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and sent out and killed all the male children who were born in Bethlehem and all the surrounding countryside, from 2 years old and under, according to the exact time which he had learned from the wise men. Now, there are a lot of myths and stories about the result of this verse, and I want to clear up some things about this. Herod believed he was mocked by the wise men, but no one knew what he told the wise men to do. So he may have been deceived, but they weren't mocking him, because when you mock somebody, you make fun of them publicly. Well, Herod believed that the wise men were out to humiliate him, and did, because they didn't show up again. Again, his paranoid attitude there. And he had all the male children in Bethlehem, 2 and under, killed. He based this on the timetable that the wise men had given him. But when it says 2 and under, we have to understand the culture and the technology and understanding of people at that time. The Hebrews had no understanding of a zero. Zero is critically important to our ability to do math today, and it was transformational when people said, oh, there's nothing. But at this time, everybody was born at 1 year old. So the day you were born, you were 1, not 0 or 1 month. So by the 12 months later, the end of the next year, you were 2. So what Herod learned from the wise men is that the star had appeared within the last year, not 2 years. So that makes a big difference as to the timetable of it. But also, too, it influences how many babies were murdered. The Coptic Church liturgy, the Egyptian Christian church, says that 144,000 babies were killed. But there weren't that many people in the area. But how many babies could have been in this small hamlet of Bethlehem that had less than 300 inhabitants? Actually, likely no more than 6 to 8 babies were killed during this incident. 1 is too many. Yes, this is tragic. No, it should not have happened. But it wasn't as widespread as we might see in some of the movies or in the stories that we hear. And it says, Then that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children. She wouldn't be comforted because they are no more. This is a prophecy from Jeremiah 31:15 that this would happen. Now, Ramah was a name of several places around Jerusalem, so we can't really locate from that. But Rachel was buried in Bethlehem. And so she, being a prominent Old Testament character and being buried in Bethlehem, kind of nailed down where this happened. So Jeremiah had prophesied this through God's influence. And this was an attempt by Herod to be even more evil. But him trying to be evil ended up following what had been prophesied by the prophets of old. Herod didn't meet a good end either. He reaped what he sowed. He lived a difficult life and died a difficult death. It was likely not too long after Mary, Joseph, and Jesus went to Egypt. Now, we talked about under Joseph, when he went to Egypt, being a skilled carpenter, could easily find work, probably found a guild or a Jewish group there to provide support. So it wasn't like they were suffering. Plus, they were wealthy at that point. Herod attempted suicide at least once because he was suffering so badly. And things went so poorly for him at the end that he altered his will 3 different times, and before he died, had his son Antipater killed, another one. But he was, from the description outside of the Bible, we know that he was in great pain physically and mentally. He was mentally tormented for years, but also had some physical problems that made this all worse. He likely, from the descriptions, had arteriosclerosis, kidney failure, and gangrene, meaning parts of his body were literally rotting off. He was in intense pain, and from kidney failure was itching to the point that it felt like his whole body was on fire. So by the time he died, he had suffered for the kind of life that he had lived. Now, what do we learn from all this? Well, the first thing is motives mean things. Herod did not have the Jewish people's interest at heart. He had his own interest first and foremost and force those things to happen, but he didn't really care that much about the people he was supposed to lead. It can also tell us that God can use evil people to fulfill his will. The things that happen in and around the story of Jesus' birth were influenced in large part by political leaders who were not believers, were evil, didn't want to do things that would support a particular religion, but ended up fulfilling prophecy by doing that. We know Caesar Augustus forced the census, and Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem, and Jesus was born at that time. We have the prophecy in Jeremiah of the people, the babies being killed, and that was fulfilled by Herod, who was also a very evil man. We also see in this is that love is a greater influence on others than fear and hatred. We can instill fear in somebody, we can get them to hate us, but that's not a great influence. You're influencing them from the negative. But loving somebody and caring about their well-being is a greater influence and greater power than fear and hatred could ever be. We also see that we need to be discerning in who we trust and follow. It says that in Jerusalem, all the people were upset along with Herod, well, because they were afraid of his reaction. And also, too, they still wanted to curry favor with him, even though he was evil. But by doing that, they were also giving up some of their own integrity. So we need to be careful about who we trust and support. We also see that we reap what we sow. I'm not real big on the concept of karma, but I do know that if you live an evil lifestyle, you're more likely to get a negative outcome, and Herod did. But the good news is that forgiveness and repentance can change our future. That's the God we worship, that we don't have to suffer for what we have done. We may suffer consequences, but God is forgiving, and repentance and changing our lives tends to focus us in the right direction. We'll talk for a few minutes about our discussion questions. First one is, how do we guard ourselves against crowd mentality? It says the people of Jerusalem were upset and afraid along with Herod, but were they doing that because they genuinely feared the message or they feared Herod? A lot of people did just go along with the crowd in order to keep themselves safe and curry favor. But what kind of outcome does that give us? People are not following their own integrity in making decisions about how they respond. So when we're influenced or encouraged to think or believe a certain way, we need to ask ourselves, is this godly? Is this what God would want me to do? And am I going about this the right way? Am I following what God's will and law is for me as I make this decision? And even if that goes against the crowd or the leadership, God takes care of us and supports us and helps us through that, regardless of how difficult it might be. Next one is, how can we change our own negative influence on others? Every one of us, because we're human, has had a negative impact on other people. It just can't help but happen. We're human. But when we want to change that opinion or change how we influence other people, one of the things they're going to want to see in us is, what are you doing? It doesn't matter so much what you believe, but what do you do? And the results of your actions and behaviors is what people will use to determine whether or not they're going to trust you again. And time after time, Herod proved himself to be untrustworthy, and people stayed out of his way. So when we're experiencing something negative from another person, ask the question, is there something I need to change about who I am? And how can I influence them positively? And then, how do we stay faithful when we see evil gaining influence? The Christian church is under assault in ways that I have never seen in my lifetime. We need to stand up for what we believe, and even if it gets us in some level of trouble, to do what we know is the right thing. That when we see somebody violating God's law, we say no. When we see an opportunity to share our faith with other people, do so in a loving and caring manner. And even when we face difficulty, God is still there for us and has a blessing in store for us that we can't understand unless and until we put ourselves out there. Thank you for joining me for this session of Advent Unplugged, and I hope this has been helpful to you. And as you go through your day, consider the discussion questions from the perspective of how does this impact how you live and what you do today. And also, too, again, I'd like you to like and subscribe to this channel so we can get the message out to other people and let you be notified when we do another video, which should be coming out soon. So, God bless you and have a great day.